Hello, it's me. It's Fel the Blythe. I'm in my usual setup for once because I finally cleaned. Soon, I'll be moving, which means I'll have a much better filming setup. But anyway, so this video, I'm going to put a trigger warning at the very beginning. I'm going to put a verbal trigger warning now. I'm going to talk about spiritual abuse. I'm going to talk about emotional abuse. I'm talking about cults today. If any of that is triggering, while I still think this information is important, I know firsthand that it can be very, very upsetting. So only watch this video if you are in the right headspace. So now we are going to define a cult. I'm going to talk about several different models here. I'm sure you've heard of the first one. And then I'm going to deconstruct some of this. So the first one, the most famous one, is the BITE model. The BITE model was developed by Stephen Hassan, who grew up as a Mooney, behavioral, informational, thought control, and emotional control. So behavioral control, this regulates an individual's physical reality, dictate where, how, and with whom members live, associates, or isolates. Information control. Deception, deliberately withholding information, distort information to make it more acceptable to the narrative, systematically lie to the cult member, allow only leadership to decide who needs to know what and when, encourage spying on other members, impose a buddy system to monitor and control members, report deviant thoughts, feelings, and actions to the leadership, ensure that individual behavior is monitored by group. Unethical use of confession, information about sins used to disrupt and or dissolve identity, withholding forgiveness or absolution, manipulation of memory, possibly false memories, as well as public shaming. Thought control, require members to internalize the group's doctrine as truth, adopting the group's map of reality as reality, instill black and white thinking, decide between good versus evil, organize people into us versus them, insider versus outsider. Using loaded language and cliches, which constrict knowledge, stop critical thoughts, reduce complexities into buzzwords. Emotional control, manipulate and narrow the range of feelings. Some emotions and or needs are deemed as evil, wrong, or selfish. Make the person feel that problems are always their own fault, never the leader's or the group's fault. Promote feelings of guilt or unworthiness, such as identity guilt. You're not living up to your potential. Your family and friends are deficient. Your past is suspect. Your affiliations are unwise. Your thoughts, feelings, actions are irrelevant or selfish. Social guilt, historical guilt. And then, of course, threats of harm to ex-members and their friends and family, which in our modern day and age could look like doxing or sending an internet mob after you. So while the BITE model is very, very useful, it also has some issues. So the BITE model has never been examined or approved by any psychiatric or mental health board, and many have criticized it for being able to be applied to many things, including things that are not cults. Additionally, Hassan himself, Stephen Hassan, who made the BITE model, has said some pretty yikes things in 2020 comparing trans communities to cults. He has since retracted those statements, but the whole situation is a mess. Not to mention, his own licensee board has subpoenaed him multiple times in lawsuits and complaints from clients that there was too many, I couldn't look into them all. So that being said, I'm going to list out two other cult checklists. And then finally, there's one called the Advanced Bonewits Cult Danger Evaluation Frame, ABCDEF. This one was made by a druid. He has since passed away, a druid and his wife. And this one is specifically geared towards pagan cults. So this one is meant from a scale of 1 to 10. So internal control, amount of internal political and social power exercised by the leader or leaders over members. Lack of clearly defined organizational rights for members. Note, if you have a group, define organizational rights for your members. External control, amount of external political, social influence desired or obtained, emphasis on directing members, external political and social behavior. Wisdom/knowledge claimed by leader, amount of infallibility declared or implied, implication is important, about decisions or doctrinal scriptural interpretations, number of and degree unverified or unverifiable credentials, wisdom, knowledge credited to leader by its members, amount of trust in decisions or doctrinal scriptural interpretations made by leaders, amount of hostility by members towards internal or external critics, and or towards verification efforts. Dogma, rigidity of reality concepts taught, amount of doctrinal inflexibility, or fundamentalism, hostility towards relativism and situationalism. Important note, many groups claim everything is valid. This does not mean that they are not orthodoxical. Oftentimes I have found, and I will get into this, groups that claim everything is valid can actually have an anti-relativist point of view. Recruiting, emphasis put on attracting new members, amount of proselytizing requirement for all members to bring in new ones. This does not have to look like join my religion. This could look like join this Discord server I'm a part of. It's awesome. They can be similar. Censorship, amount of control over members' access to outside opinions on its groups, its doctrines, or its leaders. This can look like book blacklists. Get in that. Okay, we're just going to pretend that the entire day didn't just change, and now the lighting's different. Isolation. This is the amount of effort to keep members from communicating with non-members, including family, friends, and lovers. And this can be subtle. This can kind of basically be like, we have everything you need here. You can't possibly need to go anywhere else. Dropout control, intensity of efforts directed at preventing or returning dropouts. So if someone decides to leave, it's try to slander them or you try to get them back into the fold. Paranoia, amount of fear concerning real or imagined enemies, exaggeration of perceived power of opponents, prevalence of conspiracy theories. Now this can even be something simple like manipulating screenshots, so it seems like everyone outside of your group is against you. So that's how that could look online. Grimness, amount of disapproval concerning jokes about the group, its doctrines, or its leaders. Surrender of will, amount of emphasis on members not having to be responsible for personal decisions, degree of individual disempowerment created by the group, its doctrines, or its leaders. So this is kind of like, hey, you don't have to worry about what your opinions are because I will tell you what your opinions should be. Hypocrisy, amount of approval for actions which the group officially considers immoral or unethical when done by or for the group, its doctrines, or its leaders. Willingness to violate the group's declared principles for political, psychological, social, economic, military, or other gain. Yeah, we do see this a lot. People speaking for or above the same people that they claim to defend is a very unfortunate example of this, as well as holding, say, the mod team to different standards or holding the leader to different standards than the rest of the group. Terminology. So I'm going to get into some terminology here that I will use throughout the rest of the video. High demand group, high control group, and high stress religion. So I struggle to find exactly when people began to shift terminology, but from various literature I've seen, it seems to have stemmed from a swath of cult writings in the mid-1990s. The word cult began to be associated with things like the Family, Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, Scientology, very obvious groups with discernible big bads, so to speak. And these often usually ended in death or murder. So this perception carried into fictional portrayals and Midsommar and other very dramatic examples. I think people started using other terms to sort of both broaden the definition and to kind of get away from those examples that can very easily lead people to be like, well, that's not my group because, we're not burning people in a wicker man.
Oh God! Oh Jesus Christ!
Yeah. Back in the day, I used to run what was probably one of the most popular ex-cult and ex-high demand blogs on Tumblr, which is like kind of weird for me to think about. And the terms that I saw a lot were high demand group, sometimes shortened as HDG, high control group, and high stress religion. The idea with high demand is that a group, and it doesn't have to be religious, demands a lot out of you, your time, your emotional, mental, and often physical energy. High control is obviously they have a lot of control over your life, and a high stress religion is any religion which, as you might have guessed, causes you a lot of stress. Another reason people tend to move away from the term cult is that it tends to necessitate a leader. High demand groups, on the other hand, can be toxic, traumatic, and abusive without the help of a leader or a circle of leaders. I personally prefer the term high demand group when I was in the process of deconversion, but for the sake of the video, I'll probably continue to use the term cult, but I'll probably say other of these terms just so you're not confused. Pre-cult, cult, and post-cult identity. So if you spend enough time in the ex-cult community, you'll run into terms pre-cult, cult, and post-cult identities. They're pretty self-explanatory. A pre-cult identity is who you were before you joined or before your group became culty. After a while of being in the group, the cult will slowly, through the methods mentioned priorly, chip you away of your identity. This is when you people will either get freaked out and leave, or they commit for the long haul. A cult identity is exactly what it sounds like. It is the identity that is afforded to you by the cult. Sometimes you are given the illusion of identity because otherwise it'd be easier for you to realize that you are in a cult. A post-cult identity could look hundreds of different ways. Once upon a time, I once described mine as, my post-cult identity is my pre-cult identity with the scars of my cult identity. The goal of an eventual so-called post-cult identity is to integrate the trauma and the self into a fully functional person. But post-cult is still post-cult. I can never go back to pre-cult or cult ever. Now, of course, depending on the extremity of your group, you might be able to achieve your pre-cult identity, especially online where some people are just significantly less affected than others. However, there is always something that's pretty deeply emotional about losing that group, even if it was you just realize they were toxic, and it might give you some trust issues going forward if you try to join another group. So how much that affects you depends on a multitude of factors. So it's important to note that even if a group doesn't check off every single one of these characteristics, doesn't mean that it cannot or does not cause distress. Conversely, a note I'll get into later, just because it causes you distress does not necessarily make it a cult. We all have a unique relational experiences in groups and are influenced by our past and opinions. Just like any relationship, you might not get along with someone, whereas they might get along with someone else. They might even do something that upsets you, but that doesn't necessarily make them a bad person. We can experience distress when we simply just don't match well with a group or a person. That being said, it's important to note that effects of cults and high control groups can be felt inside of societies, cultures, and various populations. For example, I wouldn't classify a friend group as a traditional cult or even a high demand group, but they can still exhibit high control and high demand culture, leaving you with traumatic effects. We see high demand groups and high control culture booming across the internet from both sides of the political spectrum. A friend and I grew up fundamentalist right-wing, which is, of course, rife with high control and high demand culture. However, we both entered very leftist communities and were shocked when we saw and experienced those same exact behaviors from the other side of the political spectrum. This is why it's important to break away from the framework that cults or high demand groups have to be religious. They can be centered around morals, narratives, or political ideology. Of course, this is something that happens organically, and it's hard to see it when you're in it. People don't join cults or exhibit these behaviors because they want to. Rather, it's a slow development, which leads me to my next section. How people end up in cults. In short, it is always helpful to remember that people don't do things for no reason. One reason could be that they've been in one before. Unfortunately, if you've been in a cult, a high demand group, or high control culture, you are much more likely to end up in another one. There's a ping-ponging, sometimes that happens, that people like to call the New Age to fundamentalist pipeline, and that pipeline also flows in reverse. This happened to me as well. The nature of trauma is repetitive. In June 1989, acclaimed trauma psychologist Bessel Kolk published a paper titled The Compulsion to Repeat the Trauma. In it, he states, some traumatized people remain preoccupied with the trauma at the expense of other life experiences and continue to recreate it in some form for themselves or for others. Many traumatized people expose themselves seemingly compulsively to situations reminiscent of the original trauma. These behavioral reenactments are rarely consciously understood to be related to earlier life experiences. This was the case for me as well. Here's something I wrote years ago when I was in the throes of my cult-based PTSD. I've noticed us, cult trauma victims, find obsession in other aspects. Revenge. The other week, I had a bit of a spat with a person that set off dangerous cult leader vibes. The ex-cult member in me, after the panic wore off, felt this overwhelming desire to attack them, or at the least call them out. This was driven by a desire to attack or defame my own ex-cult's leader, but with a fear and inability of doing so. Did it give me satisfaction? Yes, very much so. Did it help anything in the long run? Unfortunately, no. Perhaps even stranger, my desire to get retribution has no effect on my desire to return to a cultic environment. They run in tandem. To people who have never experienced our trauma, it is hard for them to understand why we might go back. Why on lonely hours of the night I Google cults. Why I'm still friends with my cult leader on Facebook, even though I hate him, while simultaneously loving him. Even this self-awareness did not make me invulnerable to culty behavior in high-control cultures. It really wasn't until I nearly completely detached myself from social media that I was able to stop this addictive cycle of trauma repetition. And this also, unfortunately, did not stop me from inflicting these behaviors onto other people. Many of us in the pagan and occult community have come from groups that check some of these boxes. It is important to note that leaving does not necessarily free you from ending up in those groups again or from perpetuating those behaviors. It can somehow make us both acutely aware of toxic traits in a group while also allowing us to ignore or even foster them. You can leave a destination but never unpack from it. I see this all the time. People taking one toxic trait from a group into another, hoping that because the group has changed, the behavior's effect must have changed as well. This, unfortunately, is not often the case. Another reason people end up in cults is love bombing and community support. Now, not everyone who ends up in a cult or hiding man group comes from something similar. And even if you do, a common tactic that ensnares people is love bombing. This often looks like unconditional love and support, someone showering you with love and expecting nothing in return. Of course, the difference between love bombing and true unconditional love is that love bombing has ulterior motives. Love bombing is conditional. You're just never told what the conditions are. And if you reject the love bomb, you will likely be met with vitriol and smeared across your community. If you accept the love bomb, you will be expected to repay that favor at the love bomber's discretion. When a cult is more established, the love bombing can even become what looks like community support. The other people of the cult are now exhibiting love bombing behaviors, oftentimes being unaware of it. Or a group of people are suddenly giving you special attention, making you feel welcome through whatever means necessary. So love bombing, as I said in my experience, is often not even intentional, which makes it so much more insidious. People have internalized and accepted it and don't even need the leader or leaders to tell them to do it. We see that the line between extreme love and extreme hate is actually very, very razor thin. Make one mistake and that love bomb becomes just a bomb. Another reason that people end up in cults is that they don't. They end up in groups that slowly become a cult. This is actually what happened to me. The church I attended, while definitely checking off some of the high demand characteristics, didn't teeter into a full-blown cult until I was around 11 or 12, when the current leader sort of took over the church. We see this a lot on the internet or in pagan groups. What starts off as an innocuous group slowly becomes insidious. People recall their memories of when the group was good, and this allows them to justify and tolerate what is currently happening. The slow fade is what I call it, and it usually begins when discourse is discouraged. Everyone begins to be expected to share the same opinions, and anyone who doesn't is either shamed into changing their mind or summarily shunned. This is a slow removal of rights and a gradual restriction in individualism. The reason I put rights in quote there is while I believe in basic human rights, these rights are not protected by a universal law. Ironically, this can happen especially in groups that claim to champion everyone is valid of course everyone is valid because anyone who is not allowed to be there. And many times this isn't explicit. If people explicitly told you, you must believe this, identifying cults would be so much easier. Rather, this is often through theological pressure, ignoring one idea and praising another, subtle tactics that tell you what to think and what to feel, projecting consequences onto belief. But with all that said, not everything is a cult. Repeat after me. Not everything is a cult. I've spent the vast majority of this video so far defining what a cult is and how you can identify them. However, I want to make it abundantly clear that defining groups as cults has been routinely abused. Since there have been definitions and guidelines for spotting cults, people have used this as just a form of mudslinging. Just because you disagree with a community doesn't make it a cult. Just because someone has a large following doesn't make them a cult leader. Just because you get banned from somewhere doesn't make it a cult. As Reddit has taught us, sometimes, yes, you are the asshole in the situation. Snarkiness aside, sometimes you and a group simply aren't a great fit. Sometimes you don't get along with the people or the leadership. Sometimes you might even have a falling out. Sometimes you might even feel upset about that falling out. That doesn't make it a cult. While it's important to identify what is a cult or a high-demand, high-control group, it is also important not to let this tip into paranoia or self-righteousness. Self-awareness in these situations can just really, in general, help you a lot. Part 2. Translating this to Discord. Okay, so all of that out of the way, let's get into the crux of the video. Spiritual Discord has a cult problem. Internet cults have existed since the internet came into being, and they develop much of the same way. Most of the high control groups that I have personally either witnessed or heard about on the internet tend to come about for a couple of reasons. One, the group forms around one or two content creators, or two, the group forms around a group of friends who might have met in another online space for a shared interest. Now, neither of these are inherently bad things. In fact, I've seen groups with both of those origin stories work out just fine if they have the proper checks and balances, which I'll get into in the final section. But when they do break bad, here's how it happens. For number one, these groups tend to function more as a fandom or even a cult of personality than as a religious organization. The group, unless through usurpation, begins and ends with the creator. If they quit or get mega canceled, they shut down the group, leaving people spiritually stranded. Some groups capitalize upon this and claim that they have a shared power and that they have checks and balances, while also, kind of subtly mentioning that the group would fall apart without them. And then for number two and number one, when the creator gets an inner circle, these can easily lead to nepotism. Surprise! Nepotism is not just for the rich and famous. That's right. You today for $0 can be perfectly capable of nepotism. This could look like a mod team giving deferential treatment to a friend for the same infraction as a stranger. That's nepotism. Appointing your friends as admins or preferring them over someone else, that's also nepotism. The life cycle of online cults can be much shorter and much more rapid. Groups generally aren't asking people to move houses or change careers just because they're not occupying the same physical space as physical cults. In many cases, especially with cults of personality, the personality in question doesn't even realize that they've become a cult leader. Because of how isolated online spiritual groups can become, they assume that every group runs the way that they do. Talking about cults makes me thirsty. What do these characteristics look like online versus in person? This could be claiming behind the scenes information that only they know. I saw the screenshots, bro, just trust me. This could be having people who are told or voluntarily monitor how other people talk about said leaders or groups on other servers. This could be doxing or threats of doxing. Much of the internet mob mentality basically is exemplary of high demand culty behavior. Yelp review bombing, swatting people, calling places of work are all very much hallmarks of physical high control groups that big scary cults do. Don't do them. What can make it even more insidious so that people will do this whether or not the leader told them to, but the leader has allowed a culture in which those things are acceptable to flourish. We talk about these a lot with right-wing groups, which are very easily identifiable as cults. But unfortunately, leftists and progressive are no less prone than this. Leftist groups can be really prone to negativity bias, leading us to undo ourselves before the right even has a chance to. So social justice language is important. Identifying appropriation is important. Calling out abusers and homophobes and fascists are important, but what is also important to recognize is that this language has and can be misused. And when these powerful and meaningful words are thrown around, these situations are made black and white, and the word loses all of that important meaning. This is called loading words, and it's a tactic that cults use. And in this case, you mask orthodoxy with progressivism. And I've seen actual ethno-nationalists hiding their actually racist ideas under progressive lingo and sucking in vulnerable people. And I've seen leftists then turn around and inadvertently spout those ideas. I actually talked about one notable book this past week, Queer Witchcraft, over on my Patreon, where a progressive author accidentally spouted ethno-nationalist ideology in the guise of progressive language. I bring all of this up because many pagan discords identify themselves as leftists and progressives. Again, this is not a bad thing. Do not misconstrue my words and think that I'm saying that this is a bad thing. However, I have seen groups like this inflict theological pressure and an orthodoxical and orthopraxical view by loading those words. I have seen them used against valid critics or detractors, whether or not they have warranted. I have seen them lobbied against victims to detract from those claims. And if someone dares to ask if those claims are warranted, those words are then thrown at them too. Ironically, so often these groups and leaders will speak over the people that they claim they are trying to defend. Do you see what I'm getting at here? One of the issues that online cults and toxic groups in general are rife with is dehumanization. We are pixels on a screen, and the stripping of identity IRL cults can take mere seconds online. So with that, I'm going to pass this over to my good friend Aaliyah Kai, who has partnered with me today for today's video.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Oh boy, this is a hell of a topic. One I'm unfortunately intimately familiar with, being a decent-sized YouTube channel in the Hellenist community. The internet is an incredible place that can facilitate connection, lifelong friendships, and amazing communities. But it also has a dark side. One that can lead us through the very design of the sites that we use most often to dehumanize those we see as public figures and even each other. When someone just becomes a name and an avatar on the screen, we're encouraged to forget that there's a flesh and blood human on the other side, one who likely will be affected by the text that we leave for them. Now, keep in mind, I'm not talking about actual celebrities with multi-millions of dollars who have done incredibly damaging things with real-world consequences, like She Who Must Not Be Named or the Muskrat. These people tend to be so wealthy and powerful that our outcry can't affect them anyhow, and they have entire PR teams to rehabilitate their images if they ever decide they want to act like humans again. Nor am I talking about casting aside actual folkism. The AFA doesn't need your sympathy, though someone taking their first steps into the rabbit hole might be able to use it if they're not all the way gone. That's a topic for a different video. What I'm talking about here is the relentless scrutiny and persecution of people who find the courage to step in front of a camera or draft a blog post about a tradition that they want to see thrive or a topic that they love. Doing so can quickly invite a torrent of hate if a creator or blogger says something another creator or blogger projects an untoward meaning onto, which cultivates a fear in any creator who wants to speak out on a messy topic that often stops needed work in its tracks. Certain topics have become so taboo that many of us are too terrified to cover them, especially anything to do with continued syncretic practices in modern Greece or ancestral rites or any variation on accepted practices that might have their basis in history, because if a suggestion is seen as a demand, well, here come the troops. At some point, the line between accountability and abuse was crossed, and large sections of the community collectively lowered their threshold for evidence, often accepting allegations of misconduct based on hearsay. I've seen antiquated phrasing from older articles projected on as politically significant when reaching out to the author in question revealed the article was both old and dealt with cultural translation issues that needed to be carefully explained without the torches and pitchforks involved in order to allow for needed revisions. I was told I was the only person who reached out in a non-accusatory manner, which was the reason that the author was willing to work with me to fix the article so a valued community resource could stay online, but without the elements perceived to be problematic. What was the response by the community prior to my intervention here? A ton of emails, apparently, allegedly, accusing the author of attitudes that they didn't hold based on assumption, with little to no real effort to understand their position or cultural sensitivity to differences between languages that can create confusion. The author was blacklisted on several blogs without ever reaching out directly to them, despite how quickly the org sent me contact info for them. It took 2 emails and a Facebook friend request with a bit of diplomacy to sort out a firestorm that had lasted months at that point. And I've seen people in the community still not believe the changes were genuine because they attribute them to the torches and pitchforks and not the intervention. The change proves that they knew there was a problem in the first place, as an attitude creates a situation in which no mistake can be rectified. Perfection from the beginning is the only solution. How dehumanizing is that? Humans aren't perfect. Our nature is to grow and change. This sort of persecution is especially nasty on Twitter and in YouTube comment sections, as well as certain Discord communities whose admins either have not discouraged or heavily encouraged these toxic behaviors. When a person becomes a text name on a screen representative of an org or a brand, which all of us have become on spaces like Twitter, whether we like it or not, all nuance, understanding, and humanity just gets tossed out the window. There's no opportunity to grow and learn when people are cast out at the first sign of a mistake, when entire blogs seemingly exist just to ensure that casting out sticks, when mistakes made years ago and long rectified come up every time someone's name is mentioned. Guess what? These are the same tactics leaders of cults of all kinds use to create the very us versus them narrative that enables their first baby steps towards power and control. Aspiring cult leaders dehumanize so that they can gain that control. When we normalize this kind of abuse, we're doing part of their work for them. As creators, bloggers, admins, and mods, we have immense responsibility to our communities. I would say the majority of us, the ones that I know at least, feel that responsibility every time we put pen to page or make an admin decision for our servers. But understanding said responsibility and being terrified of being misconstrued and having that misconstrual used as a justification for abuse, all under the banner of accountability, chills the ability for any of us to engage in proper discourse, start discussions, or deal with challenging topics in a nuanced way. There was a personal example I wanted to give here that illustrates my point about the standard of evidence often being low, but in a beautiful irony, I decided to delete it out of fear of misconstrual, even with an excessive amount of context and explanation. Talking about my own experiences could very well be seen as using a soapbox to defend myself, even if I put my own motivations into the script and honestly explain them. I can't control the projection of others onto my words, so it's safer not to speak, which is just more proof of my point, really. But before you dismiss everything I'm saying as the whining of a public figure who should have known better, remember that this is the exact attitude is wielded against people who dare to talk about traditions on Twitter or in community spaces as well. At least those who haven't gone out of their way to cultivate that culture that discourages this kind of persecution. A teenager who has a bad take on Twitter with 5 followers can be just as at risk of a dog pile if someone with enough clout or determination notices it. Or someone who's just getting started and says an inadvertently focus-sounding thing can be banned from communities without any attempt to explore if this was something that they were merely told or an actually dangerous belief that could harm the community. Certain statements are called dog whistles for a reason, after all, because non-group members don't recognize what they are. Sometimes harmful ideas propagate into the mainstream enough that it's worth exploring what someone means and believes rather than judging them on an assumption of what they said. In other words, this can happen to you too. Yes, you, the human listening to this right now. The longer you're in a community, the more likely you are to accidentally cross a line that has been drawn in the sand, whether you know it was there or not. And because of this, many more experienced pagans can be reluctant to speak up in communities that haven't gone out of their way to discourage this kind of dogpiling. But discourse is essential in pagan communities. We learn and grow by disagreeing, sharing our disagreements, and moving forward. Drowning in groupthink can kill a movement just as easily as the very evils and phobias we're attempting to root out through all the projection and assumption. I know that many of us are from vulnerable minority groups that have been done dirty in the past, but it's impossible to build a real community on trust if a sentence out of turn can lead to ostracization, especially when that ostracization can lead to real-world consequences. I've seen theological disagreements lead to doxing, threats, and harassment in the real world. I don't know when we as a community decided that was okay, but it's not. It's gonna be on each of the communities we build in turn to decide where that line is and when it comes to messing up and learning and growing, and none of this decreases the responsibility of community members, mods, admins, and creators that we have to one another. If anything, the need to allow for growth and change is an essential part of that responsibility, one that we keep forgetting. Finding the line between helping individual people and protecting our communities is work. It's a challenge, it's frustrating and sometimes overwhelming, but it's also essential. If we want to promote healthier, non-cultish communities, we need to be willing to temper ourselves and explore rather than assume. Especially if we want to keep experienced pagans in our collective communities, which is what my video in this collab is all about. Either way, I still believe that as humans, we are stronger together. And that's why I spoke out, even though I know that daring to talk about these issues can cause the very backlash that I'm talking about there. Thanks again, Fel, for having me on and for your incredible friendship. Don't forget to check out her spot over on my video. She covers the ways that toxic communities can affect longtime pagans, even after the communities themselves are a distant and vague memory. Yeah, Fel, I'm talking about you like you're not even here, what you can do about it. Anyway, back to you.
Thank you, Aaliyah Kai, for covering just the very real and tangible effects of dehumanization. So with that, part 3, what this means for all of us. Aaliyah Kai covered excellently how dehumanization doesn't just affect leaders or content creators, but it affects every single one of us online. And just as cults affect those within them and those who decide to leave, they also affect the entire religion as a whole. We are so small. Many of us don't have access to in-person groups, and if we do, we share it with multiple traditions. While this isn't inherently a bad thing, there's something to be said for sharing a space where everyone around you shares your faith. I mean, that's why religious organizations exist in the first place. The internet, for better or for worse, has meant that even when we are spread out across continents, we can still come together in shared tradition. While the internet has made this connection easier, for the most part, many of our pagan religions are not officially recognized by our governments. We are still a very tiny minority, even amongst small religions. Many pagans, especially younger ones, tend to be very averse to structure, hierarchy, and organized religion in general, whether from previous experience or general hang-ups around the idea. Ironically, this extreme aversion to organized groups has meant that we tend to glom around content creators or groups that are our friends. And groups formed around content creators will always begin and end with that creator. They come to that space as a fan, meaning, yes, you have already ended up in a hierarchical group. Now, these groups don't always break bad, and they can be really good. But when they do break bad, they end up taking a large fraction of our religion with them. It is super easy for cults to divide religions by their members alienating themselves from other groups, or for those groups that see themselves the place for the religion. And when a group turns into a cult and goes bad, we don't just lose the people in the cult. This drama can have a ripple effect, making drama-averse people or people who are new, just exploring, become turned off to the whole idea and become solitary or even leave the tradition altogether. That last one actually happened to me twice. On the flip side, many people are afraid of joining a cult or being accused of being a cult leader. While cult awareness is important, it is also very common to hurl that term onto people they simply don't like. But the effect is very real. Groups that do exist are afraid to create structure, to create organization, to experiment with hierarchy, or even with non-hierarchical structure. There's a fear of discourse because these loaded terminologies can be used as weapons instead of justified defenses. Ironically, all of these fears and avoidance can just in turn turn people into falling into cults. Because without general leadership or tenets, we can't keep each other in check. Without criticism and without discourse, we can't grow our faith or experiment with our beliefs. We can't have a group without organization. You can't have organization without some of the above mentioned things. So something has to give here. This leads me to my conclusion. In spite of all of this, we need community. As I said in a previous video of mine, community is the point. I love community. I came back to the pagan community in spite of all of this. It's okay to be solitary, of course, but it is human nature to seek out communities of faith, shared love, shared ritual, camaraderie, relatability, the opposite of loneliness, and it will only continue to damage us as groups rapidly appear and disappear. I believe that community is possible. I've spent a lot of this video how groups can go wrong, how leaders can betray you, but I want us to now examine how we can be better and what responsibilities leaders should exhibit. I am no organizational expert, and this is the part where we need your help, your ideas. Most of my experience in groups has been in horizontal organizational structure, meaning that instead of there being a vertical hierarchy, the organization has subgroups that holds each other accountable and has different uses of power, so no one person or group rises above the rest. These tend to work really well in activist groups where decentralization and shared power are critical, but there are more traditional structures that can work here. Leaders should first and foremost be self-aware and humble, because without true self-awareness and humility, and self-loathing is not the same as humility, humility is a complete decentering of the self from the narrative. These qualities allow you to have openness to criticism, not taking things too personally and knee-jerk reacting, and allowing you to take criticisms into account. Leaders must make compromises. This is why a lot of people don't want to be leaders. Sometimes you have to compromise and make difficult decisions. You also have to be able to accept blame. If you turn around and put the blame onto someone else, you are not going to be a good leader. Leaders must be able to be held accountable too. If your group would completely crumble if the leader changed, then this group will never have true accountability. With that, I hope all of this video was not too much of a downer, but I think it was so important for me to bring up as a cult survivor and as someone who has seen this happen so much throughout our communities. I want to hear your ideas. What do you think makes a good leader? What would you like to see in a religious organization? What would you like to see in a group? How would you like this group to make you feel? What does accountability look like to you? So with that, thank you again, Aaliyah Kai, and I have linked my Patreon above if you would like to check that out. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons, Grumpy Grandpa, Hayakinto, Sakita, Hakubi, Tenneth, Alcanet, Ambrose, Brooke Smoody, Amber Kelly, Javion Franklin, Micro Maria, Paris Moreski, and Tiny Atlas.